Hello and welcome to How Could We, a podcast by Climate-KIC where we explore the collaboration we need, the lessons we've learned, and the areas where we see the most impact when it comes to climate action. I'm your host, Anne-Sophie Garrigou, and today we're coming to you live from Change Now, a global gathering of innovators, changemakers, policymakers, and funders working to accelerate solutions to the world's most pressing environmental and social challenges. I'm really honored to be joined by Joshua Amponsem. Joshua is a leading advocate for locally led climate adaptation. Joshua is the co-director of the Youth Climate Justice Fund and founder of the Green Africa Youth Organization. He has spent the last decade not only pushing for more inclusive and just climate policies, but also building real solutions with communities on the front line of the climate crisis. He's helped shape international forums like the UN Youth Climate Summit and led groundbreaking work on youth and adaptation, including the Global Youth Call to Action on Adaptation. His work challenges on the colonial roots of climate funding and calls for a new era of climate finance, one that truly supports local leadership, youth innovation, and indigenous wisdom. Today we're going to talk about the injustice of climate finance, the need to support leadership coming from the Global South, and what it takes to shift decision-making and funding to the communities that are living and leading the transition. Joshua Amponsem, thank you for being here on How Could We podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So Joshua, can you tell us where your climate journey began? What was the moment or experience that pulled you into this work?
I think one of the key moments was when I was in university. I learned about climate change for the first time. Grew up in Ghana, schooled in Ghana, and was schooling on the University of Cape Coast on the coast. And I think the driving factor was fundamentally seeing all the impacts of climate, coastal erosion, sea level rise, the impact of on the coastal communities, and realizing that a lot of young people who are studying environmental science and its related courses, who are meant to be the workforce to solve this problem, they get out of universities and they don't get a job. And they go work somewhere else, like in banking, in finance, or in the informal sector. And I ask myself, if the people who are learning in this field are not being given the opportunity to solve these problems, when are we going to solve these problems? So that was my journey in how do we transfer the skills and knowledge from classroom, make it practical for young people to be able to be the leaders in driving change in communities. And that was the journey for me.
You've worked across global platforms yourself, right? From the UN Youth Climate Summit to the Climate Adaptation Summit. Even you worked on those global platforms, you stayed deeply rooted in community action. Why is local leadership so essential when we talk about climate action?
It's very simple. I have not seen durable solutions when it comes to climate change without local leadership and ownership. This is why for me, with everything I do at international level, global events, global policies, international policies, and reformations and structures and declarations, none of that is going to make a long-lasting difference in our lives in the future we want if we leave communities and leadership in communities behind. And the reason why that is the case is because no one understands much better than the person who actually goes through the experience. Someone who lives, somewhere in the US or in the UK or in Germany can never understand truly what it means to build flood resilience in Bangladesh or to build heat resilience in Accra. You would need the people there who live there, understand they have done the research there, following the issue. And this is why I keep advocating for local ownership and local leadership, because I think without it, we would have change, but those change will not be durable and they will not be sustainable.
Yeah, and I feel like it's quite sad how this discussion on having the local knowledge come into the more global project is just starting to come into the discussion. I think it's very concerning. I really want us to talk about something that I've heard you speak a lot about at many conferences, the injustice of funding and on sort of like climate colonialism. How does the funding for climate is still shaped by colonial patterns? Can you help us unpack what it looks like today?
Yes, it's sad, and it's a sad reality that we've overlooked to the point where it's become normal. But it's absurd, right? 78% of all the funding that is given for climate research in Africa are not given to African researchers. They are given to global north researchers. If you look at it and you look at indigenous communities, you see the same thing, right? Only 1% of funding on forest, on climate goes to these communities. And yet everyone says, indigenous people, they have a lot of wisdom and they are the people, they protect, majority of the world forests, and that is what is protecting and serving all of us. So why can't we trust them with these resources? And in today's world, philanthropy is designed in a way that even philanthropic entities that are practicing trust-based philanthropy, who are you building the trust with and who is trustworthy? Right? And in most cases, it still goes back to that resources, going back to people that we know, we are familiar with, we are friends with, and those resources get stuck with them. There is not enough appetite to actually investigate, get closer to the issues we're talking about, and respect the authority, the knowledge, the insights of people who live with these issues and give the resources to them and say, lead. The other challenge that we're seeing now, and I find very sad, is the idea and that philanthropy practice of really getting excited about single shot leaders. And I say single shot leaders as the definition for people who have expertise in one thing. That is the way to fundraise now, right? Someone comes up, they are an expert on energy, and even within energy, they are an expert in specific part of energy, and they get funding for their work. Someone comes, they are an expert in rural health and mobility. They get funding for that. You have to define a single point expertise to get resources. The challenge with that is that the issues we face today are too complex that single shot solutions do not work. They serve a short-term purpose, so they generate results in the short term, which can look very beautiful, but then all those results get bulldozed or they wash away very quickly as other societal occurrences come into play, right? Whether it's conflict, whether it's extreme weather events, whether it's the crackdown on democracy, whether it's the shrinking of civil spaces, all of those things affect every single short solution that you try to focus on. And I think it is about time that we start looking at our world from a very intersectional perspective and realizing that we need to back intersectional leaders and move away from single shot approaches of doing things. And that is the work of the Youth Climate Justice Fund. We set up this fund with the idea that we need to start building young leaders to appreciate intersectional leadership. Yes, they might have an academic background in health, and that is great, but they've also lived through a community that have gone through war, and they have been involved in peace negotiation that actually make them a practical expert in peace negotiation. And we need to value both things, that while one person could have an academic background and a trained background in health, they could also be experts in peace, and they can bring both of those things onto the table, and they should be rewarded for that. But right now, I think we're pushing people to choose one thing because, of course, when you go to the table and you say, I work on health and I support hospitals and health infrastructure and I work on peace, people are like, so what exactly do you focus on? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I want to invest in this because it looks like you don't have a focus. It looks like you're doing everything and you're everywhere, and that is where the problem comes in. Because the more we bring multi-dimensional perspective, the more we can build durable solutions. And I think philanthropy should really rethink how it invests and start thinking about how do we make intersectional leadership rewarding.
So what would it look like to decolonize climate funding? And that's what I think the impact that you're seeing with your organization. What does it look like in practice?
I think in practice, when we think about decolonizing philanthropy and finance and funding in general, it's not really about giving money. And I think that has been the fantasy we've had for a very long time in the world that, if you want to prove that we are decolonizing, we're just going to give a lot of money to some group and say, we've given them the money and that is it. It's about power dynamics. Right? If you want to decolonize, because colonization was about power. It was a power dynamics. It had nothing necessarily to do with the resource. It was a question of who has the power to control who. And how much space do you have to make your own decisions, to chart your own path of development, leadership, growth, versus what you're being told to do by another person. So if you really want to decolonize finance, I think it's going to be really a question about how do we think about the entire restructuring of the entire financial architecture to ensure that we're not just moving resources to communities, right? But we are also giving them the power and the determination on the path of where they want to go and allow them to pursue that path in their own way. So a lot of people talk about debt cancellation, for instance, and it is great. But I think if you cancel all the debts of some African countries, I know very well that in 5 years, they will still have a lot of debt again, because the power dynamics they have now in the economic infrastructure is going to just accumulate debt, because A, they are not able to add any value to their raw materials. B, they are not able to come to the table in global economics agreement and trade agreements with a purchasing power authority that work for their own good. And on top of that, in many cases, they do not have actual technological capacity to be able to advance their own resources. So if you want to think about that and decolonize that, it's not just about canceling the debts. It's also giving them the power and authority to decide how much they want to sell their resources for. It's giving them the opportunity to add value to those resources locally before they trade it. It's about recognizing that, just like we do in many other places, you have to use local workforce and talent in developing materials and building materials locally. And that is what it's going to come down to, beyond the money. So I think when I really look at decolonization, there's a huge multiple ways to go, but I think it's fundamentally going to come down to who holds power, how do we level the ground, and how do we give people the power, the autonomy, and the free will to be able to have the resources they need to decide. And that's why in my speech earlier today, I said it's not about rescuing people. It's about giving them the resources, the space, and the authority over their own path, and being available to support them in pursuing that.
I really wanted to talk about this because it's been a few years now that finance and those topic of like changing the way the climate finance is done is at the very high level, is being discussed at the high level. We had the loss and damage fund that was decided a few years ago, and now they're setting it up. And we see in the discussions that are happening that these like power struggles are still benefiting the same countries and the same entities. So I think I really wanted to spend some time on this, and I really thank you for bringing that on the podcast. This season we are talking about climate adaptation, and I wanted to include you in this season because you've pioneered community-led zero waste projects in Ghana that blend circular economy principle with climate resilience. And I wanted to ask you about, what does the local ownership that we talked about before, what does it look like in these kind of projects?
So now in 2018, I set out to set up the first sustainable community project, as we called it at that time, with the Green Africa Youth Organization. The idea was very simple. Go to a community and understand what does sustainable development mean to them and what is their biggest priority. In many communities in West Africa, that was waste management. If they could get rid of the piles of waste that was sitting just around the city, causing sanitation risk, sanitation health diseases, and posing risk to all the aspects of their life, the air pollution, both indoors and outdoor, that would make a big difference for them. And we ask ourselves, okay, how do we do this and have the community ownership and leadership? We realize that the waste collection system is designed to give contracts to formal waste management companies. But a lot of the waste is also being collected by individual waste pickers, who are mostly women, and individual waste collectors and waste processors, who are all informal, and they are using tricycle, tuk-tuk, and all these very sort of basic ways of collecting the waste. But they collect more volumes of waste than the formal companies. So how do we bring the leadership of these people into the local governments and realize that, yes, you issue contracts to these companies and they do a great job, but without these heroes within the community, the change is not going to happen? And that is what we did. We came into the city of Accra. We started with one specific municipality, the Ladede Kotopon municipality. And what we did was to work with the municipality and the community to put value on the work that the informal waste workers were doing. Got them an office, gave them an identity that could be integrated into the municipality structure, and have them as equal stakeholders. And together, they created a zero waste plan for the city. And with that plan, it was very clear the role of these women, the role of the formal companies, the role of the law enforcers, and the role of the community together. And just like that, within a span of 2 years, the plan was already being implemented. The amount of waste that is now being diverted from being burnt to cause air pollution, or from being sent into a landfill site where it generates methane, or just sitting around and getting the kids to, making kids sick because, the flies and all of that significantly reduce, and in a single community, that work in 1 year, reduce as much emissions as a round flight trip from Accra to London. And this is what it means for the community. But then on top of that, the beautiful thing is that by doing this, the women, the informal waste pickers and collectors, earn more income by doing this because they are integrated into a formal structure that recognizes their work. It gives them more dignity. And in addition to that, for big events and conferences and global policies on plastics, like the Global Plastic Treaty and the UN Environment Assembly, we support these informal waste workers and these women to go and be in the room and support the negotiation because they know how best to get plastics out of communities, right? It's not going to be the think tanks that know how to do that. They can talk to them and extract information and bundle it together, which is great. But what about having them in the room when these treaties are being negotiated? And that is what we did. And for me, this is really giving shape practically what does community and local leadership look like.
It's really interesting because we talk very often about how to accelerate climate action, how to scale climate action, and what you're proving, like in 2 years, like a project was just implemented just because by involving the people who are responsible to the informal waste pickers, for instance, like you need their buy-in. You cannot do the policy without them, right? So by just like involving the community, the project was successful in just a couple of years. We talk so much about locally led adaptation, climate action, etc. But how can today, like donors, governments, NGOs actually support it without co-opting it? Because it's good to have the people in the room. It's good to listen to the people. As you said at the beginning, we're all talking now. Like all of the white organizations are talking about listening to indigenous people, listening to people on the ground. But it's not just about listening and having them in the room because they're there at the COP, right? But it's about actually involving them in the process, and it's very difficult. We see, for instance, that the least developed countries, a group as part of the UN negotiation, they don't have the resources to participate as like others. So how can our listeners or organization support that without co-opting it?
I mean, it's a very good question, and tokenization, co-opting is something that happens very often. And to the person being tokenized or co-opted, sometimes you don't even see it until you're already tokenized. And sometimes the one tokenizing is not even aware that they are tokenizing, right? And in many cases, they are aware that they are co-opting, they are diluting the message, and they are really diminishing the influence that you are bringing into the room. But in some cases, people also don't know. The way I think about it and how to prevent this is, I think having a clear principle as an organization on how you engage minority groups is very important. So I work with youth climate councils. I have set up youth climate councils in the past. And one of the first things we said was if a city or a ministry want to engage young people and have their input, here's the reality. Whichever group of young people you invite, they cannot represent the entire spectrum of young people. You have students, you have early career researchers, you have people who are already working in the workforce, you have the informal side of it, you have people who are unemployed, and they all have different needs. How do you represent this? It's very difficult. So even if you're inviting young people to the table, you have to acknowledge that you're still going to have some gap. And how do you close those gaps? And how do you even empower those who are coming to be a representative voice? And typically it comes down to being able to resource the people that you are inviting to the table, to be able to consult with their communities, their constituencies, their groups, and have a collective input. 2, accountability. So they come, they represent, they give input, and most often they don't hear anything again, right? So they are being invited into the room, and they make input, and then they never hear back. Were their inputs accepted? Were they integrated? Were they used? Were they involved? Were they not used? And why were they not used? Were they helpful? Were they not helpful? No sense of accountability in many instances. And that's the second thing you need to have as an organization, as a company, as an entity thinking, okay, I need to resource these groups because, of course, you are being paid for your job. Sometimes the groups you are trying to consult, they are struggling for their everyday livelihood. So how can you resource that and make sure that they have the resources they need to be able to come into the space, but also the resources to consult a broader community? So you can actually say, yes, We invited young people into the room and they consulted with their constituencies, and we have a wide array of input. And then two, being accountable to them and go back and say, thank you for your input. You shared with us ABC. We took it to our team and I'm sorry they cannot implement it, but these are the reasons why they cannot implement it. So let us know what you think. Or yes, you gave us the input. Yes, they are going to implement A and B. For C, they need more information about this. Can you help us in supporting that? But that level of accountability is very important. If not, co-opting, tokenization is constantly going to happen because A, you can take the input of one person and say, oh, I consulted with indigenous people, but you spoke to just one person, most likely someone who is already privileged within that community. Or you say, oh, I consulted with young people for this work, and then it's your friend who is young that you just invited to come have coffee with you, right? So how do we truly do this, and how do we have a process internally in organizations to map out the steps of this level of engagement to avoid the co-opting and the tokenization?
And so if we really centered local leadership, indigenous and youth voices in climate adaptation, climate action, what do you think it would look like today? And I feel like it would look like very different to what it is today, but what would it look like, and how could we support the leaders already doing this work instead of trying to create something new, for instance, from the outside, which also very often happens, is that we create something instead of looking at what's happening on the ground and supporting this. So what would it look like? How can we support it?
Yeah, I'll start with the last one. I think, I'm a big believer of inside-outside strategies. There are many times you got to get inside there and figure it out and help people to figure out. And then in doing that, you hit a wall. And only when you hit a very hard wall, because a lot of the walls we hit are walls you can break down.
So do you mean for people to go there, to go to the places where it's happening?
Exactly. So in this case, if you really want it and you say, okay, I don't get it. I think there's this community in India and I would really want to go there and I want to support them in building resilience against, the monsoon floods and the flash floods. So, I'm going to go do it. Okay, great, right? But go on a clean sheet. Go with the intention that I'm trying to understand what people really think about this and what are all the things they've tried and how can I be able to help and how can I support them. So go with a learning approach. How do I go? How do I learn? And after learning, how do I work with them to find something? That is the first approach. And of course, you go in there, communities can sometimes tell you, we are missing funding, the local government don't pay attention to us, whatever. Okay, investigate that further and try to ask them, okay, how can we help? How can we help? How can we help? How can we support? What do you need? Those are the things that are very helpful. Until you hit a wall where you realize, okay, everything here comes to this point, and now we need to set up a new thing or a new structure that allow to be able to achieve these goals. Now, of course, wherever you're setting something up, like I've said before, think about who has not just the moral authority, but who has the local insights, knowledge, relationships, and the historical artifacts and knowledge and wisdom to be able to really do this and do it in a durable way. So in the end, you're going to set something up maybe, but you're going to do it with the people and they will have the leadership and you are there to support. So that is one. The other thing I want to talk about is what could this look like? It's very simple. I think in brief, it's not going to look anything we have now, because I think everything we have now is really structured around trying to meet targets and goals, because we have all these global targets and we use that to set funding, we use that to unlock resources, and everyone's trying to meet some target and all of that. And I think when you work with communities, their timelines are very different. Their timelines are not the timelines of these targets, right? Their timelines are more around really long-term, durable solutions that goes beyond generations. So I think what we're going to see is people who are really committed, who do not speed, because it's a question of speed and direction. And in many cases, you find in communities that people have a lot more patience on how they approach a problem, right? And what they are looking for rather is the right direction. And once they have the right direction, they can get there. So it's not really about the speed. It's rather the combination of a good sense of direction before the speed comes. And I think for adaptation, we will see a lot more local leadership, a lot more well-paced approach that really gives leadership and ownership to people, that support the livelihood of people, that in many cases might have nothing to do with the word climate itself, but it will have a lot to do with livelihood. It will have a lot to do with jobs. It will have a lot to do with well-being. It will have a lot to do with care. It will have a lot to do with empathy. It will have a lot to do with safe housing. It will have a lot to do with food, right? It's going to be all the things that people need in their everyday life being prioritized and being centered. And it's going to be less of all the jargons and the language we use now and more about very, very basic things, right? Healthcare, education, food, water. It's going to come down to some of these basic things. And in many ways, when I talk to people in communities and you ask, what does a resilient community mean to you? What does a safe future mean to you? What does a better future look like to you? It's come down to these things. Am I going to have a home? Can I have a roof over my head? Can I have a house that is resilient against the heat? Can I survive the next cyclone? Can I survive the next flood? Can my farm withstand the next drought? Can my kids have access to better school? Can they sit in a classroom and learn? It's just fundamental things that we need, and that is what resilience means for many people around the world. And it's not just big, heavy infrastructure. It comes down to just everyday things that people need, and it comes down to a lot of it is power dynamics. Would I have a say in that decision? Would I be able to influence this in my work? So I think that is what it's going to look like, and people might be very shocked because depending on what bubble you are in, sometimes it really feels like, it's all about some of the big words we use, but it's in many cases very basic.
I think sometimes we need this shock.
Yeah. Very much so.
That made me think. I was wondering if you had book, like something to recommend for people to go further on those discussion, on those reflections. So I don't know if it's a book, if it's a movie, a podcast, whatever it is. Do you have something an idea for people who are more interested in those questions? Do you have resources to share?
The simple thing I would say, to not make it complicated, is talk to someone on the other side of your coin. I think mostly we're trying to find answers in all sort of things. Like we're reading books and we're watching a lot of things. And I have found the most useful thing in many cases is talking to a business executive of a company that I really have a lot of doubts about, or talking to someone in philanthropy where I feel like they are not doing great, right? Talking to a government representative, a local office, municipality, a mayor, talking to someone who is maybe even in the fossil fuel industry, and what do you do? Why do you do what you do? And trying to understand, right, what are the challenges you face? What do you think about this? So when people say this, how do you feel? What do you believe in? What are your beliefs? What are your values? What are your principles? Until we understand what the other side feels, go through, and their theory of change and their value and their principles, we are not influencing anybody. We're just talking to each other and patting each other on the back and saying, yeah, we need this, and agreeing all the time. But we need to disagree to be able to know where is the pivot for change, right? So yeah, if you are, and I call something relational capital. And relational capital for me is something that has changed a lot in the past 10 years as the digital world really exploded. And that was simple. Like 10 years ago, only a few people had the privilege of understanding what really goes on in countries within outside of their continent. So I knew a lot of people in Europe that when I first started my climate work, I meet them and they have no clue what agriculture means in Africa. And they imagine the farms they have in Europe, and they imagine that, and they're like, oh, you're a farmer. Oh, that's so cool. Farmers are doing so great. No, I'm sorry. It's very different on the other side, right? And when someone says, oh, we're going through a famine, it's like, what does that even mean? We experience droughts and floods. Like, what does that mean? Because the floods here and the response to floods is very different than the response to floods in Ethiopia, right? The droughts here in Europe is very different from when communities in rural Uganda are going through droughts. But I see that the more people build relationships with people on the other side of the world, and they keep in touch and they hear from each other, the more they had empathy and the more they had a better understanding of what these things mean for people. And I think by that, it really changed the way they perceive all these things we're talking about: sustainability, climate solutions, climate action. It really helped them to put it into context on what does this mean for this person? Like, what does it mean to be a human in this context? And I think in many cases we've lost that. And that is my biggest recommendation. Talk to someone on the other side. Talk to someone, in a different sector, in a different field, in a different country, in a different continent, and understand what does this mean to you. What are your values? What are your principles? What does change mean? What does sustainability mean to you? What does climate action mean to you? What does resilience mean to you? And how do we get there?
Thank you. And so before we close this episode, I want to ask you, what would a just, beautiful, and climate resilient future look like for you?
I think for me, the way that looks like is highly intergenerational, highly intersectional, and resourcing those who live closest to the problem, providing trusting them and redefining our parameters for trust and risk.
Thank you so much, Joshua Amponsen, for coming on How Could We podcast. Really, really appreciate your time and the discussion we've had.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How Could We, part of our special season on climate adaptation and resilience. Today we heard from Joshua Amponsen, whose work demonstrates that climate leadership is not something to wait for, it is already taking place, driven by young people, local communities, and those on the front lines who are responding to the crisis with courage, vision, and lived expertise. We talked about the injustice of climate finance, still rooted in colonial systems of power, and the urgent need to shift funding and trust towards locally led solutions and climate action. We explored what true local ownership looks like, how to support youth without tokenism, and what a just and climate resilient world could feel like if we listen to those already building it. You will find more information about Joshua's work with the Green Africa Youth Organization and the Youth Climate Justice in the show notes. This episode is part of a wider campaign by Climate-KIC, spotlighting bold, community-driven solutions to the climate crisis, from cities to rural regions, from policy spaces to grassroots movements. You can find out more on our website and on social media. The links are all in the show notes. If you found this conversation meaningful, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with someone working towards a more just and resilient future. Thank you for listening. Bye!